Good morning, I'm Diane Macedo. Thanks for streaming with us. In today's update, Europe may soon be open to vaccinated Americans and tourists from other countries deemed COVID safe. EU officials and politicians are debating how to reopen to tourists this summer after EU ambassadors passed a recommendation saying travelers from certain countries should be allowed in with some kind of COVID passport and testing. But there are some obstacles. Since it's not a binding agreement, politicians in the European Parliament still have to negotiate an agreement. Meanwhile, here in the U.S., Texas Governor Greg Abbott issued an executive order banning mask mandates for government properties across the state, including public schools. The schools now have until June 4th to end their mask mandates. Starting May 21st, any official who tries to mandate masks, even for unvaccinated residents, could face a $1,000 fine, but officials are pushing back. Houston's mayor calls the order an overreach, tweeting, "If you are a city employee and you have not been fully vaccinated, you must wear your mask." The House of Representatives is set to vote on a commission to investigate the January 6th assault on the Capitol. If the legislation passes in both the House and Senate as expected, a bipartisan panel would be tasked with looking into the causes of the siege and recommending ways to prevent similar attacks from happening in the future. But the proposal could run into trouble in the Senate, where Minority Leader Mitch McConnell has said he's undecided and wants to push pause on the bill. McConnell's comments come after House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy said he would oppose the bill, potentially giving cover to Republicans unwilling to upset former President Trump. And President Biden spoke with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu again this morning about the violence in the Middle East. According to the White House, President Biden said he expects to see a significant de-escalation today on the path to a ceasefire. But the White House isn't saying what could happen if the deadline isn't met. Those calls for a ceasefire in the Middle East are growing as Hamas signals it would end its attacks if Israel meets its conditions. But Israel is showing no sign of letting up, with more airstrikes in Gaza overnight. At least 222 people have been killed overall in Gaza and Israel, and an estimated 58,000 have been displaced due to the violence. And as more people get vaccinated and COVID cases decline, many corporations are beginning to decide whether or not to head back to the office. ABC News Prime anchor Lindsay Davis took a look at what a post-pandemic working world would look like.
Across all industries and trades, the pandemic upended the working world.
The coronavirus pandemic that has much of the U.S. and the world on lockdown.
Governor Andrew Cuomo extending the state's work-from-home order.
Well, it may be a while yet before many of us are allowed to return to our places of work.
Crowded cubicles and conference rooms switched to Zoom chats virtually overnight. But as more people take their vaccines and the COVID cases continue to plummet, the future of work could soon be at a crossroads. While many essential workers who tirelessly put in hours on the job throughout the pandemic will have little change in lifestyle, many corporations are beginning to revisit what a working world post-pandemic looks like. According to LinkedIn, nearly 25% of all applications on the site in late April and May of 2021 were for remote jobs, a 7% increase from last year. Companies like Twitter announcing that they'll continue to allow employees to work from home permanently, while other companies like Citigroup, Microsoft, and Google have announced a hybrid model, a mix of work from home and the office for their employees.
I think that it's quite possible that over the next 5 to 10 years, about 50% of our people could be working remotely.
But some say it's time to hang up the pajamas and come back to the office full time, like J.P. Morgan CEO Jamie Dimon.
Yeah, I'm about to cancel all my Zoom meetings. I just think I'm done with it.
But as the sights are set on the future of the workplace, the statistics from the past year are hard to ignore. There's still nearly 17 million people on unemployment, and some 8.2 million jobs have still not recovered from before the pandemic. Among the hardest hit, women. More than 2 million left the workforce during the pandemic in what's been dubbed the she session.
There was not enough time in the day for me to meet the needs of my children and my own needs and my professional needs.
Our economy cannot fully recover unless women can participate fully. It's a national emergency, and it demands a national solution.
To discuss the future of work, I sat down with Karen Kimbrough, the chief economist at LinkedIn. So, Karen, give us a sense of what you feel like the new normal in the workplace is going to be.
I think going forward, employers are looking at ways to bring their employees back into the office. Many companies are, hoping to be back in the office at some point in the fall. And I think what it means ultimately is that there will be more flexibility in the workplace than there was pre-pandemic, but probably not as much as the full remote story that we're all experiencing still right now. We find that our members want to go back. They want to see their colleagues. They want to collaborate.
So what does it mean for the people who left the cities and went to the suburbs and even left the state feeling like, hey, I can do my job just as effectively across the country?
So it largely depends by industry. And for people, I'd say for people who migrated, and by the way, we did see a lot of migration during the pandemic to the suburbs, as you say, Lindsay, but also from big cities to smaller cities. I think some of that may be there to stay. People chose to look for a place where maybe it was more affordable, they had more space, or in some cases, millennials who are now at that age where they're settling down and having children are looking for just that more suburban experience. I wouldn't call time on cities. I do think that big cities will come back. I think it's very cyclical. And when you look at the cities, that's where a lot of the jobs are. That's where a lot of the entry-level jobs are, where grads go when they finish college. So I think there's still some life in the cities, and I think they're going to come back.
I'm curious if you have any idea about the future styles of offices, because, you know, there was at one point in the last decade this, you know, massive attempt to have all this open workspace. Now that people are so worried about germs and coming into close contact with people, do you feel that that might change?
Definitely. I think they're reconfiguring the space both for the way we work, but also for ensuring that people feel safe and confident about coming back to work and being in larger groups together. And as the vaccine, you know, of course, gets rolled out and people choose to get that vaccine, then hopefully, you know, they will feel safer together. But companies are preparing for what that new normal will look like. And I think they're reconfiguring their spaces to accommodate that.
You know, working moms really were, in many cases, hit hard by, you know, as far as going to work every day and trying to balance, you know, having their kids at home. What do you feel it will take for working moms to get back into the workforce?
Oh, full-time school. I'm a working mom, so I have that answer ready. I think schools need to be open full-time in order to give working moms the latitude that they need to get back to their job. You know, we survey our own members, and the working moms are the ones who report the most burden. What I will tell you is what we've seen since then is that women are pretty resilient, and they've been coming back. They've been reentering the workforce. What, you know, maybe worries me a little bit is that I think women lost some ground during the pandemic. And they had to step away. And so that takes longer for them to regain, especially women in senior positions. They haven't bounced back as quickly. But I think long-term, what women want to see is they want to see flexibility. They want to be able to balance that work and home life.
If you pull out your crystal ball, what do you see as the industry of the future when we're really talking about, hey, this is where a lot of people are going to be focusing their education, and this is where a lot of the job growth is going to be?
We would say there could be as many as 150 million technology jobs globally across all industries in the coming years. Every role is going to have some aspect of technology to it. So what I would just encourage people to do is understand the software or the technology that you can use in your role as a tool to help you be more efficient or more effective. Don't feel that you need to fear you're going to be automated out of your role, but use it as a tool to serve your purposes. I want to always leave people with a really positive sense that they can be empowered to, you know, figure out what skills you have, which ones you need, and which ones you want to unlock your opportunity. And I think that really the wave of the future for work is going to be skills-based, so that employers are looking for employees who have specific skills as opposed to a particular degree.
And speaking of empowering the worker, you know, there were a lot of people who really ditched their 9-to-5s this year and kind of picked up a passion, a hobby, an entrepreneurial spirit. Do you feel like that could also be a wave of the future?
Absolutely. There is a lot of flexibility built into the world of work in that dimension too, where you may have your main job that is a salary that's fixed with the company. And you may also have something on the side that you're doing because it's a passion project or something you're building. And when we surveyed our members, they often said that they were very interested in kind of thinking about, after this pandemic, what is it that makes my heart sing? What is it I want to focus my life's purpose on? And I think maybe there's a silver lining there, and that we all kind of had a chance to reflect on what we want to do and be.
Our thanks to Lindsay Davis for that report. And nearly 100 years after the Tulsa Race Massacre, a new ABC News Live documentary is taking a closer look at one of the most brutal and rarely talked about attacks on Black Americans in U.S. history. When we come back, our Steve Osunsami joins with the search for answers almost a century later. It's one of the most violent attacks in American history, and also one of the least talked about. In the spring of 1921, an angry white mob descended upon a thriving community in Tulsa known as Black Wall Street, killing as many as 300 Black Americans and burning more than 35 city blocks. Bodies of the victims were never recovered until now. 100 years later, a dozen wooden coffins have been discovered in an unmarked grave. ABC News senior national correspondent Steve Osunsami takes a deep dive at the search for answers in a new documentary special. Take a look.
Do you remember when she told you and other members of your family?
Well, absolutely. Actually, I was working in Los Angeles. And I was at my desk, and the phone rings, and it's the front desk, and they said, well, Joy, do you know an Eldoris Makandashi? And I'm like, what? What about it? What you know about my grandma? You know, I'm
panicked.
I'm about to get mad.
Right.
And I went out to the front desk, and there she is on the front page of the Los Angeles Times with the caption, "A City's Bury Shame." And there's my grandmother.
That was the first you heard about this?
Of the complete story, yes.
ABC News senior national correspondent Steve Osunsami is here with me now with more on this. Steve, thanks for being here and for all your reporting on this. The Tulsa Massacre, it's one of the most violent attacks in American history, but also one of the least talked about. What struck you most as you set out on this search for answers?
I think that's the big thing that struck me. It was not really talked about. And I will say that, you know, I am super proud to be part of the team that is telling this story, because we are essentially shining a light on a bit of history that, as I write in the documentary, was lost in the fog of aging memories. You know, this was a story that wasn't talked about by the Black families who it happened to, or the descendants of the white families who perpetrated this crime on this Black neighborhood about 100 years ago to the day, and for very different reasons. One group was either afraid or didn't hear the story, afraid of what would happen if they actually shared the story. The other group was embarrassed by what happened. And so, you know, we talk a lot, Diane, about, you know, this racial reckoning that we hope is happening in this country, and it doesn't begin to happen until we sort of speak the truth to events like this one. And, you know, and I also want to point out something we mentioned in this documentary. The way that this sort of became known is interesting. It happened in the 90s after the bombing of the Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City. There were lawmakers at the time who wanted to say that that was the greatest act of domestic terrorism in Oklahoma. And there was a Black lawmaker who stood up and said, while this was tragic, you know, what happened in Greenwood, what happened at Black Wall Street was a greater tragedy. More people were killed. There was a loss of generational wealth. You know, there was a neighborhood of hundreds of families, of Black families, that was succeeding, where people had true success and wealth, and that was taken away in this violent incident that so many Americans are just really learning about now. Diane?
To think that it took the Oklahoma City bombing for it to come to the national attention in that way. And Steve, I know this morning the Judiciary Subcommittee is having a hearing with descendants of survivors of the Tulsa Massacre. Viola Fletcher, the oldest living survivor, spoke on Capitol Hill just moments ago. I want to play a clip of that for you.
My name is Viola Ford Fletcher. I'm a survivor of the Tulsa Race Massacre. 2 weeks ago, I celebrated my 107th birthday. I still see black men being shot, black bodies lying in the street. I still smell smoke and see fire. I still see black businesses being burned. I still hear airplanes flying overhead. I hear the screams. I have lived through the massacre every day. Our country may forget this history, but I cannot. I will not, and other survivors do not.
Powerful words there from Viola Fletcher, survivor of the Tulsa Massacre. Steve, I know you've talked to some of these survivors or descendants of survivors. How significant is it for them to finally be sharing their stories at this level 100 years later?
Hugely significant. You know, that just really moved me. She is 107 years old and still remembers what happened as if it happened yesterday. And that's what we have heard from the different survivors and from their families who've heard these stories. You know, being able to tell this story now is hugely significant to these black families who feel like the world has forgotten what happened to Greenwood. And, you know, there was a woman who we interview in the documentary. She is the granddaughter of one of the survivors, and we played a clip from her just a second ago. Her name's Joy McConaughey, and she told me that, you know, when all of these people like myself come to town, come to Tulsa, you know, come and sort of, you know, take part in the telling of the history, that she hopes that when we leave and when we tell this story to America, that we tell it right. She kept telling me, make sure that, Steve, you tell it right. And that's really one of the goals that I and the team that worked on this have in this documentary, was making sure that we tell this story right. Because, you know, for the first time, people are hearing about the bombs that were thrown down on this black neighborhood, the destruction that happened, the generational wealth that was lost. And Diane, one very important point, the missing. This is also still a murder investigation. Up to 300 people walked out of their homes and never came back. Their bodies never recovered. There were no funerals. For a long time in Tulsa, Oklahoma, there were rumors of these mass graves. And what you ended up seeing happening is that in the black community, those rumors persisted. No one knew for sure, but they were rumors. And what you heard in the rest of the city is that, oh, there's no way that can be true. Those rumors were confirmed with the discovery of these bodies. Not only did they find 12 coffins, but they also, according to the scientists who were conducting the dig, found what looked like stair steps in the mass grave that allowed you to get down to other graves. They're still continuing their search. In the next week or two, there's another dig. We plan to follow that to see what they find. But I got to tell you, when they found those bodies, it confirmed a lot of suspicions that many people had across Tulsa, and really began sort of telling the truth about what happened in Tulsa. This documentary, of course, is called Tulsa's Buried Truth, and the truth was found when they found those bodies, and people are now only beginning to discuss it. It's a powerful moment of reckoning for the city of Tulsa. In the documentary, we hear a lot from the mayor of Tulsa. His name's G.T. Bynum. He is a white mayor whose family is one of the original families to live in Tulsa. He talks about how, even though one of his grandparents or father was head of the Tulsa Historical Society, that he never knew about the massacre until he was an adult and one of his relatives was running for mayor. That he had gotten through most of his life without knowing that this atrocity truly happened. This is someone who should know. And what's happening now is that people are hearing the story, learning the story, and there is a reconciliation that's happening, and some of it is searching for the dead. And also, there's a big conversation that we also touch on about a very delicate issue, and that is the issue of reparations. Should these families whose loved ones were killed, whose property was taken and lost, who never got a single penny from insurance companies, should these families be compensated for their loss? And that's an issue that the city of Tulsa and its residents and the state of Oklahoma are struggling with today. Diane.
And Steve, I know you also talked to singer Charlie Wilson. He's one of the most famous voices to come out of Tulsa. Let's hear a little bit of that conversation.
Singer Charlie Wilson is one of Tulsa's most famous sons, and today he's talking about it. He's the lead singer of the Gap Band, who sold millions of records and named themselves after Greenwood. The initials GAP stand for the streets of Greenwood, Archer, and Pine that lead into the neighborhood.
We decided to take on that name because we knew we was going to go all over the world. At least I did. I knew we was going to go all over the world, and we'd have to talk about that.
When the band was touring in the 1980s, he says they tried to share the story of the massacre while they were promoting their albums.
Well, people were just kind of looking at us like, are you sure? I've never heard this story before. So, I mean, you know, even that we told the story a lot of times, nobody really responded to it because they just never heard of the story because it was forbidden to talk about.
So Steve, explain a little bit, why was it so important to Charlie Wilson to spread this story, to get this message out there? And what's being done now to ensure that schools, for example, are now telling this story in history classes?
So Charlie Wilson, who is the lead singer of the Gap Band, was born and raised in Tulsa. They named their band after the streets that border into the neighborhood, Greenwood, Archer, and Pine. Charlie Wilson has been wanting to tell the story that he shared with us for a very long time. And he tells the story of someone very close to him, a woman from his childhood who survived the massacre, who shared details of what happened to her and begged him, because she was so afraid of what could happen to her if her story was told, she begged him not to tell the story until she died. She died a few years ago. He is now telling her story. He shares it with us. We share it with you. In terms of education, you know, there is a movement now to try and share the story of the massacre in public education, in particular in Oklahoma, but it's running into some roadblocks. There is a bit of concern from the governor of Oklahoma that the school curriculum shouldn't be sharing history lessons that make a significant population feel guilty for that history. And so there's a fight ongoing about how best to share the story of the massacre, the Tulsa Massacre from 1921, in public schools in the state of Oklahoma. A lot of people, of course, who feel that the story needs to be told plainly and honestly. So, you know, I will say, though, that despite that fight, there is a movement now, as we are talking about reconciliation in America, of understanding what happened and sharing the stories. Hollywood is now sharing the story of the Tulsa Race Massacre in the series Watchmen, Lovecraft Country. Our documentary special here, of course, there are a number of other efforts, too, that are trying to tell the story. Essentially, the word is getting out, and people are understanding and learning what happened. And for many, it's the first time. Diane.
And Steve, after all of your reporting on this, what do you hope viewers take away from this documentary special?
I want viewers to know that it's not over, that there are families who are still struggling with the loss of their loved ones. There is something about having a loved one taken away from your family violently and having this mystery that lasts for so long that is really tough on a family and very difficult. They're building a new history center in Tulsa to celebrate the survivors and to honor the legacy of the people who were killed. I think that's important. But I think that the biggest takeaway, I think, is that, you know, and I'm going to paraphrase the mayor of Tulsa, who essentially said that a government or society, when it's dealing with an awful happening, can take a couple different approaches to how they reconcile that happening. One is to ignore it, to rewrite the history, to bury it in the past. The other is to acknowledge it up front, speak the truth about it, and then begin the healing process of moving on. It is clear that the people of 1921 took the previous approach. And what's happening now is that the government of today, the people of today, the black and white families of today, and black and white Americans across the country are deciding now's the time to speak the truth to these events and understand what truly happened so that we can learn from them and move past them. Diane.
All right, Steve Osunsami, thanks for that and for your reporting on this. And you can watch Soul of a Nation, Tulsa's Buried Truth on Hulu right now. That does it for this ABC News Live update. I'm Diane Macedo. Thanks for joining us. And remember, ABC News Live is here for you all day with the latest news, context, and analysis. I'll see you back here at 3 p.m. Eastern with Terry Moran for The Breakdown. Stay safe.
Hi everyone, George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel, and don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.